To begin, we have the explorer who opened Europe's eyes to the wonders of Asia, Marco Polo. Marco Polo was born in the year 1254 in the city of Venice, which at that time was a flourishing centre of commerce and maritime power. He was born into a family of merchants, and the Polo family had already established trading ties stretching far beyond the Adriatic Sea. His father, Niccolo Polo, and his uncle, Maffeo Polo, were seasoned traders who had journeyed eastward into the lands that Europeans knew only through rumour and fragmentary reports. During Marco's early years, his father and uncle were absent on one such expedition, a venture that would shape the course of his own life profoundly. While Marco was still a young boy, Niccolo and Maffeo travelled all the way to the court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor who ruled over an immense domain stretching from the Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean. They arrived in the Mongol capital around 1266 and were received by Kublai Khan himself. The Khan, intrigued by these men from the distant west, sent them back to Europe with a request that the Pope dispatch learned men to teach Christianity and Western customs in his empire. When Niccolo and Maffeo returned to Venice around 1269 or 1270, they brought news of these ambitions and tales of lands more vast and wealthy than any known in Europe. Marco's mother had died during his father's absence, and he was raised by extended family. He grew up hearing the stories of the East and absorbing the mercantile spirit of Venice. In 1271, when Marco was about 17 years old, his father and uncle prepared to return to the Mongol court, this time determined to fulfill Kublai Khan's request and expand their trading prospects. Marco joined them, setting out on what would become one of the most famous journeys in history. Their route took them first across the Mediterranean to Acre, and from there overland through Armenia and Persia, then along the Silk Road. They faced arduous terrain, crossing deserts such as the forbidding expanse of the Gobi. They travelled by camel caravan and passed through cities that were hubs of trade and culture, places where goods and ideas flowed between Asia and Europe. At times the travellers endured illness, shortages of water, and threats from bandits, but they persevered, driven by the promise of fortune and the remarkable favour of the Mongol emperor. After nearly 4 years of overland travel, they arrived at Kublai Khan's court, likely in Chengdu, around 1275. Marco, still only in his early 20s, quickly distinguished himself in the Khan's eyes. He displayed curiosity, a talent for languages, and an adaptable manner that made him a useful intermediary. According to the account attributed to Marco, Kublai Khan took a strong liking to him and appointed him to various positions, sending him as an emissary and inspector to distant provinces. For many years Marco Polo lived in China and other regions of Asia, observing with meticulous interest the customs, commerce, and technologies of the Mongol Empire. He reported on paper currency, efficient courier systems, massive cities such as Kanbalik, today's Beijing, and elaborate ceremonies at the imperial court. While some later critics doubted whether he had truly reached all the places he described, the breadth and consistency of his observations have given historians reason to believe he did indeed travel widely within the empire. Marco claimed to have visited areas as far as Yunnan in southwestern China, and he described journeys to Burma and India, though the precise scope of his travels has been the subject of scholarly debate. What is clear is that he spent roughly 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan, becoming familiar with lands and cultures that were almost entirely unknown to Western Europe at the time. Eventually the Polos grew anxious to return home. They had been away from Venice for a quarter of a century. Kublai Khan was reluctant to let them leave, but an opportunity arose when a Mongol princess was to be sent by sea to Persia to marry a ruler there. The Polos were given permission to accompany her as escorts. Around 1291 or 1292 they departed China by ship, sailing down the coast of Asia, through ports in present-day Vietnam and Indonesia, then across the Indian Ocean. The voyage was long and perilous. Many in the convoy died of disease and hardship, but the Polos survived and delivered the princess to her destination. From Persia, they travelled overland through Trebizond and Constantinople, finally arriving in Venice in 1295. They had been away for 24 years. Their appearance was so altered, and their stories so astonishing, that even their relatives struggled to recognise and believe them. According to accounts, they brought back gems and treasures sewn into their clothing, proof of the wealth they had gathered. In Venice, Marco Polo soon became involved in the conflicts of the city-state. In 1298, during a naval battle against the rival Republic of Genoa, he was captured and imprisoned. While in captivity, he met a fellow prisoner named Rustichello da Pisa, a writer of romances. It was during these months in prison that Marco dictated the narrative of his travels, which Rustichello compiled into a manuscript known as Il Milione, or the Travels of Marco Polo. The work became one of the most influential travel accounts in European history. It described lands of immense riches, sophisticated cities, unfamiliar customs, and wonders such as porcelain and coal. While some of its claims were met with skepticism, and later generations debated the veracity of certain episodes, the book opened European imaginations to the East. In centuries to follow, it would inspire explorers such as Christopher Columbus, who carried a copy on his own voyage westward. After his release from prison, Marco returned to Venice and resumed life as a merchant. Though he never again embarked on journeys of comparable magnitude, his legacy was already taking shape in the written record of his adventures. He married and had 3 daughters, living out his later years in relative prosperity. Marco Polo died in Venice in 1324. According to tradition, when asked on his deathbed if he regretted exaggerating the tales in his book, he replied that he had not told half of what he had seen. Whether or not every detail was precisely as he described, there is no doubt that Marco Polo's journeys expanded Europe's awareness of Asia and inspired generations of travellers. His life stands as a testament to the curiosity and endurance that drive exploration, and his name remains synonymous with the spirit of adventure. Next, we have Ibn Battuta, who journeyed farther than any explorer of his age, tracing the vast roads of the Islamic world. Ibn Battuta was born in the year 1304 in the city of Tangier, in what is now Morocco. He was born into a well-regarded family of Islamic legal scholars, part of the educated elite of North Africa. From an early age, he received training in Islamic law, or Sharia, a foundation that would serve him throughout his life. Though he was raised with the expectation of becoming a qadi, a judge versed in the complexities of Islamic jurisprudence, his restless spirit and deep devotion to his faith pushed him toward a different destiny. At the age of 21, in 1325, Ibn Battuta set out on what was intended to be a pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj that every Muslim is encouraged to perform at least once if able. He left Tangier alone, without companions or the security of a large caravan, an unusual choice given the perils of the road. This decision marked the start of a lifetime defined by movement, curiosity, and unshakable faith. The journey to Mecca alone was long and arduous. He crossed North Africa along the Mediterranean coast, travelling through places such as Algiers and Tunis. He observed and described the varying customs and levels of religious devotion among the communities he encountered. In Egypt, he marvelled at the vibrancy of Cairo, then one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities of the Islamic world. He sailed down the Nile to see Upper Egypt before heading east across the Sinai and into the Arabian Peninsula. Ibn Battuta completed his first Hajj in Mecca in 1326. For many, this would have marked the fulfillment of their journey. But for Ibn Battuta, it was only the beginning. Motivated by a desire to see the world, to learn from renowned scholars, and to visit the great centres of Islam, he resolved to continue travelling. Over the next decades, he he would become the most widely travelled individual of the pre-modern world whose journeys are reliably documented. After Mecca, he travelled to Iraq and Persia. He visited Baghdad, though the city had never fully recovered from the devastation wrought by the Mongols in the previous century. He met scholars, judges, and Sufi mystics along the way, always eager to learn and share knowledge. His journeys were never simply for trade or sightseeing. They were quests for religious fulfillment and scholarly enrichment, though they also satisfied a powerful personal wanderlust. Returning to Mecca for another Hajj, he stayed for some time, immersing himself in study and spiritual practice. But the call of the road remained irresistible. He joined caravans and travelled down the East African coast, visiting places such as Mogadishu and Kilwa. He marvelled at the sophistication of these coastal cities, centres of trade linking Africa with Arabia, India, and beyond. He described their architecture, markets, and rulers in detail, offering one of the few surviving eyewitness accounts of these societies in that era. From Arabia, he crossed the Indian Ocean to India, arriving around 1333. There, he sought service at the court of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the Sultan of Delhi. The Sultan, known for both his intelligence and his erratic cruelty, welcomed Ibn Battuta and appointed him as a Qadi. The position suited Ibn Battuta's legal training, and for several years he lived at the heart of one of the wealthiest and most powerful courts in the Muslim world. But life at court was not always secure. Delhi was rife with political intrigue, and the Sultan's paranoia put many at risk. Seeking to remove Ibn Battuta from these dangers, while also taking advantage of his abilities, the Sultan appointed him as ambassador to the Yuan dynasty court in China. The journey from Delhi to China would prove to be one of the most perilous and eventful legs of his career. Ibn Battuta's caravan travelled to the port of Cambay and then to Calicut on India's southwestern coast, where he intended to embark by ship. However, disaster struck. The ships carrying his gifts and companions were destroyed in a storm, and the survivors were captured or killed by pirates. Ibn Battuta himself barely escaped with his life, wandering destitute for some time before making his way back to the Deccan Plateau. Despite these setbacks, he eventually resumed his journey by sea, travelling across the Indian Ocean to the Maldives. There he stayed for nearly 2 years, becoming involved in local politics and serving as a judge. He was struck by the island's beauty and the devotion of their Muslim inhabitants, but he also found the political environment fractious and unstable. From the Maldives he sailed to Sri Lanka, visiting the famous Buddhist shrine at Adam's Peak, which local Muslim tradition associated with the biblical Adam. He continued on to the Tamil country of southern India, and then once more set out for Bengal. His wanderings took him across the Bay of Bengal to Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia, and from there to the port cities of southern China. He likely arrived at the busy port of Quanzhou, one of the world's great maritime hubs of the time. In China, Ibn Battuta observed cities of astonishing size and wealth, complex bureaucracy, and advanced technology. He visited Guangzhou and perhaps even Beijing, describing the Grand Canal and the paper money system in use under the Yuan dynasty. He marvelled at Chinese ships, which dwarfed the dhows of the Indian Ocean, and recorded his impressions of the unfamiliar customs and religions he encountered. After spending time in China, Ibn Battuta began the long journey home. He retraced his steps through Southeast Asia, India, and Arabia, returning to Mecca for yet another pilgrimage. But even then, his travels were not over. He went to Anatolia, where he visited Turkish cities and encountered both Muslim scholars and Christian communities. He crossed the Black Sea into the territories of the Golden Horde, meeting the powerful Khan and travelling to the Crimean Peninsula. His wanderings continued into the heart of Central Asia, where he visited Samarkand and Bukhara, once jewels of the Silk Road. He travelled to Persia again, and eventually made his way back to North Africa. Even after returning home to Morocco, he did not immediately settle. He was sent as a diplomat on a mission to the Kingdom of Mali in West Africa. He crossed the Sahara with a caravan, an ordeal that tested even his hardened experience. In Mali, he visited the capital of the Mali Empire, likely meeting Mansa Suleiman, and documented the empire's wealth, the piety of its rulers, and the vibrant scholarly culture of Timbuktu and Gao. His descriptions of West Africa remain among the most important sources for historians studying the region in the 14th century. Finally, after decades of near-constant travel covering an estimated 75,000 miles, an extraordinary achievement in any age, Ibn Battuta returned to Morocco and settled in Fez. By then, he was in his 50s. At the order of the Marinid Sultan, he dictated the account of his journeys to a scholar named Ibn Juzai. This work, known as the Rihla, or the Journey, became a unique record of the medieval Islamic world's vast extent and cultural diversity. Ibn Battuta spent his final years in relative quiet, though the precise date of his death is uncertain. He likely died around 1368 or 1369. Though for centuries his work was little known outside the Islamic world, it stands today as one of the most remarkable travel narratives ever written. His journeys spanned continents, connected cultures, and offered a vivid portrait of a world that was deeply interconnected long before the modern era. Ibn Battuta's life remains a testament to faith, curiosity, resilience, and the unquenchable human desire to see what lies beyond the horizon. Next up, we have the man who commanded the world's largest fleet to carry China's power across the seas, Zheng He. Zheng He was born around 1371 in the province of Yunnan in southwestern China, during the waning years of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty and the rise of the native Ming dynasty. His birth name was Ma He. He was a member of the Hui ethnic group, Chinese Muslims whose communities traced their ancestry to Central and West Asia. His family practiced Islam devoutly, and Ma He grew up hearing the call to prayer and learning the traditions of his faith. As a boy, Ma He's life changed dramatically when Ming forces moved to consolidate their control over Yunnan. In the 1380s, the Ming army defeated the remnants of the Mongol loyalists in the region. Ma He, only about 10 years old, was captured by Ming troops. As was common practice, he was taken as a prisoner and made a eunuch, a procedure that was brutal but would allow him entry into the imperial service. He was brought to Nanjing, the Ming capital at that time, where he entered the household of Judi, the Prince of Yan, one of the sons of the Hongwu Emperor, founder of the Ming dynasty. Under the Prince of Yan, Ma He displayed intelligence, loyalty, and a commanding presence. He rose through the ranks of the prince's household, trusted for both his administrative abilities and his military skill. He served Judi during a turbulent period when the Ming succession was contested. In 1399, Judi launched a rebellion against the Jianwen Emperor, his nephew. Ma He proved himself on the battlefield during this civil war, helping Judi seize the throne in 1402. Upon his victory, Judi ascended as the Yongle Emperor, one of the most forceful and ambitious rulers in Chinese history. In recognition of his service, Ma He was granted the honorific surname Zheng, becoming Zheng He. He was also elevated to the rank of Grand Eunuch, one of the most powerful positions a man in his circumstances could hold. Zheng He's loyalty was rewarded not only with status, but with the emperor's trust in overseeing some of the most ambitious undertakings of the Yongle reign. The Yongle emperor had vast ambitions for his empire. He sought to secure China's borders, rebuild its capital in Beijing, and assert Ming authority as the rightful centre of the world. One way to do this was through an extraordinary series of maritime expeditions that would project Chinese power and prestige across the seas, establish diplomatic ties, and extend the tribute system that framed China as the Middle Kingdom. Zheng He was chosen to lead these voyages, commanding what would become the largest fleet ever assembled up to that time. The so-called treasure fleets were a marvel of naval engineering. They included massive 9-masted ships known as treasure ships, some said to measure over 120 meters in length, along with hundreds of support vessels carrying soldiers, officials, interpreters, craftsmen, and gifts of immense value. The first expedition set sail in 1405. Zheng He led his fleet from China's coast southward to Southeast Asia, visiting ports in Champa, modern Vietnam, Java, and Sumatra. He negotiated with local rulers, bestowed gifts, and secured their acknowledgement of the Ming Emperor's suzerainty. The voyages were diplomatic missions, but also shows of force, as the ships carried thousands of troops capable of subduing resistance when needed. From Southeast Asia, Zheng He's fleet sailed westward across the Indian Ocean to reach the great ports of South Asia. He visited Calicut on India's Malabar coast, a vital node in the trade networks linking east and west. His mission was to establish Chinese prestige, encourage trade under Chinese terms, and gather exotic goods, animals, and envoys for the Ming court. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He commanded 7 major voyages, each one pushed further than the last. On later expeditions, the fleet sailed to Sri Lanka, where tensions with local rulers led to open conflict. Zheng He defeated a rebellious king and took him prisoner back to China, demonstrating the Ming Empire's readiness to enforce its will abroad. Beyond India, Zheng He's ships crossed the Arabian Sea to the Persian Gulf, visiting Hormuz and the Red Sea, reaching ports like Aden and Jeddah. While there is no direct evidence he set foot in Mecca, he carried gifts for the Sharif of Mecca, honouring the holy city central to his own Muslim faith. Most famously, Zheng He's expeditions reached the Swahili coast of East Africa. He visited ports such as Mogadishu, Malindi, and perhaps even Kilwa, establishing contact with African rulers who sent giraffes, zebras, and other exotic animals as tribute to the Ming court. These creatures caused a sensation in Beijing, testifying to the breadth of the emperor's power and the wonders of the wider world. Zheng He's missions were not voyages of conquest in the European sense. They were intended to display Chinese supremacy and incorporate foreign rulers into the tribute system. The fleet brought gifts and traded for local products, but also enforced compliance when diplomacy failed. Zheng He himself was known as a skilled negotiator and diplomat, but also as a commander who did not hesitate to use force if required. Throughout his career, Zheng He demonstrated extraordinary organizational skill, logistical mastery, and diplomatic acumen. He commanded fleets numbering hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men, coordinated supply lines across thousands of miles of ocean, and managed relations with dozens of polities with diverse languages, cultures, and interests. Despite the astonishing scale of these voyages, they were eventually curtailed. The Yongle Emperor died in 1424, and his successors were less enthusiastic about such costly maritime undertakings. The final voyage under Zheng He's command took place around 1431 to 1433. He sailed once more to Southeast Asia, India, and the Arabian Peninsula, reaffirming China's influence one last time. Zheng He is believed to have died during or shortly after this final voyage, possibly in 1433. Some accounts suggest he died at sea and was buried there, while others claim he died after returning to China. Regardless, he left behind a legacy that was both celebrated and eventually forgotten in official histories, as later Ming rulers turned inward and abandoned the great oceanic expeditions. His voyages stand as some of the most impressive maritime undertakings of the pre-modern world. They demonstrated China's technological and organizational prowess, and they left a legacy of diplomatic ties, trade connections, and cultural exchange stretching from East Africa to the Persian Gulf, India, and Southeast Asia. Today, Zheng He is remembered not only as a formidable admiral, but as a symbol of China's brief extraordinary age of maritime exploration, a testament to what can be achieved through vision, ambition, and mastery of the seas. His journeys remind us of the connections that have always existed across continents and cultures, and of the enduring human desire to see what lies beyond the horizon. Next, we have the man who set sail into the unknown and changed the course of history forever, Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was born between late August and late October of 1451 in the port city of Genoa, in what is now Italy. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a wool weaver and small-scale merchant, while his mother, Susanna Fontana Rossa, managed the household. Columbus grew up in a bustling, trade-centred city on the Ligurian coast, surrounded by stories of merchants and sailors travelling the Mediterranean, a world criss-crossed by competing maritime powers. From an early age, Columbus was drawn to the sea. He received only a modest formal education, but he read extensively, especially works on geography, navigation, and the travels of Marco Polo. As a young man, he took to the sea himself, working on trading vessels that sailed to ports as distant as Chios in the Aegean, and possibly even to the coasts of England and Ireland. He gained practical knowledge of winds, currents, and the perils of piracy, experiences that would shape his vision of long-range oceanic voyages. In the early 1470s, Columbus moved to Portugal, then the leading centre of European maritime exploration. Lisbon was alive with talk of voyages down the West African coast and around the Cape of Good Hope to India. Portugal's navigators and map-makers were expanding European geographic knowledge, while its merchants were eager to bypass Middle Eastern intermediaries in the lucrative spice trade. Columbus married Philippa Moniz Perestrello, the daughter of a Portuguese nobleman and one of the early settlers of Madeira. Through this marriage, Columbus gained valuable connections and access to nautical charts and experience with Atlantic navigation. In Portugal, Columbus became convinced of an idea that would define his career. He believed that by sailing west across the Atlantic, one could reach Asia more directly than by rounding Africa. The concept of a spherical Earth was not controversial among educated Europeans of his time, but Columbus dramatically underestimated its circumference and the size of the ocean. He relied on optimistic calculations, misunderstandings of classical sources, and selective readings of travellers' accounts. Columbus spent years seeking backing for his plan. The Portuguese crown rejected him, seeing his calculations as flawed and preferring their proven route around Africa. Columbus then turned to Spain, which had only recently completed the Reconquista with the conquest of Granada in 1492. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, were eager to expand their power, wealth, and influence, especially in competition with Portugal. After much negotiation and repeated appeals, Columbus finally secured their support in April 1492. The so-called capitulations of Santa Fe granted him titles, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor-General of any lands he might discover, as well as a share of the wealth from those lands. His mission was to find a westward route to Asia, securing trade and potential converts for Christianity. Columbus's first voyage set sail from Palos de la Frontera in August 1492 with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After a stop in the Canary Islands, they sailed west into the uncharted Atlantic. The crossing took longer than many crew members expected, provoking fear of mutiny, but Columbus maintained his course, calming the men and keeping double logs to manage their anxiety about the distance. On October 12, 1492, land was sighted. They had reached an island in the Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador. Believing he was in the Indies, he called the indigenous people Indians. Over the following weeks, he explored parts of the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola. He made contact with native Taino populations describing them in his journals as generous but ripe for conversion and servitude. On Hispaniola, the Santa Maria ran aground and was lost, forcing him to leave behind a small settlement called La Navidad. Returning to Spain in March 1493, Columbus was hailed as a hero. He brought with him captives, gold trinkets, and tales of fertile lands, feeding European imaginations about a rich Asian frontier. The Catholic monarchs received him warmly and quickly authorized a second voyage, this time on a grander scale. The second expedition, launched in 1493, involved 17 ships and over 1,000 men. It aimed not only to explore but also to colonize and convert. Columbus revisited the Caribbean, founding settlements on Hispaniola and encountering increasing resistance from indigenous populations. Conflicts broke out, fueled by demands for tribute, harsh treatment, and cultural misunderstandings. Disease and violence ravaged native societies, setting the stage for patterns of colonization that would have devastating consequences. Columbus continued to insist he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. On his third voyage, begun in 1498, he sailed further south, reaching the mainland of South America at the Orinoco River Delta in what is now Venezuela. This was the first time he saw continental land in the New World, but even then he struggled to reconcile it with his belief in being near Asia. By the time he returned to Hispaniola, his rule there was increasingly resented by both colonists and the crown. Complaints of mismanagement, brutality, and chaos reached Spain. In 1500, the Spanish authorities sent Francisco de Bobadilla to investigate. Columbus was arrested, shackled, and returned to Spain in disgrace. Though he was released and his titles formally restored, he never again held the same level of authority over the lands he had claimed. Determined to find a passage to Asia, Columbus convinced the crown to finance one last expedition. The fourth voyage, from 1502 to 1504, was marked by further hardship and exploration. Columbus and his men explored parts of Central America's Caribbean coast, including present-day Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. He hoped to find a strait leading to the Indian Ocean, but was thwarted by geography and treacherous conditions. Shipwrecked in Jamaica for over a year, Columbus struggled to maintain control and secure rescue. He returned to Spain in 1504, aged and ill. Though he retained his titles in name, he was largely sidelined. He spent his last years petitioning the crown for the rewards he felt he was owed under his original agreement. On May 20th, 1506, Columbus died in Valladolid, still convinced he had opened a new route to Asia. He never understood that he had instead encountered continents previously unknown to Europeans. Columbus's voyages had enormous consequences. They inaugurated sustained European exploration and colonization of the Americas, leading to profound and often tragic changes for indigenous peoples. While he was celebrated for centuries as a daring navigator who connected continents, modern perspectives also recognize the violence, enslavement, and cultural destruction that followed in his wake. Yet Columbus's life remains central to the story of exploration. He embodied the ambition, faith, and flawed understanding of his age. A man driven to cross an ocean in search of the known, but who instead found the unprecedented. His voyages transformed the map and altered the course of history, setting into motion exchanges of plants, animals, people, and ideas that reshaped the world forever. Next, we have Vasco da Gama, who found the sea route to India and opened the gates of global trade. Vasco da Gama was born around 1460 in the town of Sines, on the southwestern coast of Portugal. He was the son of Estevão da Gama, a minor nobleman who served as commander of the fortress at Sines, and Isabel Sodré, whose family was of English descent and well connected in maritime circles. Growing up in this coastal environment during the height of Portugal's age of exploration, Vasco was steeped in a culture that revered seamanship and discovery. Portugal's explorers were pushing further and further down the West African coast, seeking a sea route to India that would bypass the overland routes controlled by Muslim powers and Italian middlemen. Little is known about Vasco's early education, but he likely studied mathematics and navigation, subjects critical to maritime success. He joined the Portuguese Navy as a young man, honing his seamanship and tactical skills. His first recorded mission came in 1492, when King John II of Portugal ordered him to seize French ships in retaliation for attacks on Portuguese interests. Vasco carried out the task with efficiency, proving himself a loyal and capable servant of the crown. Portugal's quest to find a sea route to India had become one of the kingdom's great national projects. Decades earlier, Prince Henry the Navigator had sponsored voyages that advanced Portuguese knowledge of the African coast. By the time Vasco da Gama came of age, Bartolomeu Dias had already rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. But no one had yet sailed all the way to India and back to establish direct trade. King Manuel I, who ascended the throne in 1495, was determined to realise this ambition. In 1497, he appointed Vasco da Gama to lead an expedition to reach India by sea. The choice of da Gama reflected the king's trust in his ability and tenacity, even if Vasco did not yet have a reputation as Portugal's greatest navigator. The expedition set sail from Lisbon on July 8, 1497, with 4 ships: the São Gabriel, the São Rafael, a caravel, and a supply ship. The fleet rounded the West African coast, stopping at the Cape Verde Islands and then sailing far into the South Atlantic to catch favourable winds. This bold manoeuvre, called the Volta do Mar, reflected advanced Portuguese navigational understanding. After months at sea, they rounded the Cape of Good Hope in November. They faced rough seas, storms and scurvy among the crew, but pressed onward along Africa's east coast. They stopped at trading ports in what is now Mozambique, where they encountered Muslim merchants whose trade networks connected to India and beyond. The Portuguese were treated with suspicion, as their intentions threatened the well-established Arab and Swahili commercial networks. Pushing northward, they reached Mombasa and then Malindi in modern-day Kenya, where they forged a crucial alliance with the local ruler. At Malindi, Vasco da Gama secured the services of a skilled pilot, likely an experienced Arab or Indian navigator, who guided them across the Indian Ocean using the monsoon winds. In May 1498, after nearly 10 months at sea, the expedition landed at Calicut on India's Malabar coast. Calicut was one of India's major trading centres, bustling with merchants from across the Indian Ocean. Vasco da Gama met with the Zamorin, the local ruler, and presented gifts and letters from King Manuel I. However, the gifts were seen as paltry by local standards, and negotiations were tense. The established Muslim merchants, whose trade dominated the region, opposed Portuguese inroads and warned the Zamorin of their intentions. Despite these challenges, Vasco da Gama managed to secure a modest agreement, allowing him to load spices for the return journey. The expedition's voyage home was even more punishing. Scurvy decimated the crew, and many died before they rounded the Cape of Good Hope again. When Vasco da Gama finally returned to Lisbon in 1499, his triumph was nonetheless undeniable. He had completed the first direct sea voyage from Europe to India and back, proving the feasibility of the route and opening the way for a new era of trade and empire. King Manuel I received him with honours. Vasco was given titles and rewards, including the rank of Dom and lands and pensions that elevated his family's status. But Portugal's involvement in India was only beginning. In 1502, Vasco da Gama was given command of a second, much larger expedition, this time not simply to trade but to impose Portuguese power. He sailed with a fleet of 20 ships, heavily armed and prepared for conflict. This second voyage reflected the shift in Portuguese policy from exploration to imperial assertion. Upon arriving in India, Vasco used both diplomacy and violence to force favourable trading terms. He bombarded Calicut when the Zamorin refused his demands and intimidated other ports into granting Portuguese privileges. His methods were brutal. On one infamous occasion, Vasco da Gama captured a ship carrying Muslim pilgrims from Mecca and burned it at sea with hundreds of men, women and children aboard. These acts shocked even some of his contemporaries, but were part of a deliberate strategy to intimidate and establish Portuguese dominance over Indian Ocean trade. Returning to Portugal in 1503, Vasco da Gama was richly rewarded, but also resented by rivals who contested his power and methods. For years he remained in Portugal, largely outside the administration of the Estado da India, the Portuguese colonial government in Asia. He watched as other commanders like Afonso de Albuquerque consolidated Portugal's growing network of forts and trading posts from Goa to Malacca. In 1524, late in life, Vasco da Gama was finally appointed Viceroy of Portuguese India by King John III. His task was to restore order and curb corruption among Portuguese officials who were enriching themselves at the Crown's expense. He sailed to India once more, arriving in Cochin to take up his post. Though he brought administrative reforms and sought to stabilise Portuguese rule, his time there was short. Vasco da Gama died in Cochin on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1524. His remains were initially buried in India, but later returned to Portugal. He was laid to rest with great ceremony, his legacy secure as one of the central figures in Portugal's Age of Discovery. Vasco da Gama's voyages had a profound impact on world history. He established the sea route that allowed Portugal to dominate the spice trade for decades, ushering in an age of European colonial expansion in Asia. His expeditions marked the beginning of a new global interconnectedness, but also of violent conquest and exploitation that would reshape societies from Africa to India. Today, Vasco da Gama is remembered both as a brilliant navigator whose daring opened new horizons, and as an agent of imperial power whose voyages brought immense wealth to Portugal at enormous human cost. His life stands as a testament to the ambitions, contradictions, and lasting consequences of the age of exploration. Next is the explorer who revealed that America was a new world, forever changing the map. Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci was born on March 9th, 1454, in Florence, one of the great centres of Renaissance culture and learning. He came from a well-connected family of merchants and public officials. His father, Nastasio Vespucci, was a respected notary, ensuring that Amerigo received a solid education in the classical traditions of Latin, astronomy and cartography. Growing up in a city known for its scholars and map-makers, Vespucci developed a lifelong curiosity about geography and the wider world, even though his early life was not marked by seafaring adventures. In his youth, Vespucci worked for the powerful Medici family, the banking dynasty that effectively ruled Florence. By the 1480s, he was handling commercial and diplomatic tasks for Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, cousin of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Amerigo's work involved managing business accounts, arranging shipments, and maintaining correspondence across Italy and beyond. This experience sharpened his organizational skills and introduced him to the world of long-distance trade. Around 1491, Vespucci moved to Seville in the Kingdom of Castile, then at the forefront of Atlantic exploration. Spain was newly unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, and Christopher Columbus had just begun petitioning the Spanish crown for his transatlantic voyage. Vespucci worked for the Medici's commercial interest there, collaborating with a Florentine firm that provisioned ships and outfitted expeditions. He likely met Columbus himself and certainly would have heard all the details of Columbus's first voyage when he returned in 1493 claiming to have reached Asia by sailing west. Vespucci's career turned decisively toward exploration after 1495, when he became involved in preparing ships for Atlantic voyages. By 1497 or 1499, he had joined one of these expeditions himself. The details of his early voyages are complex and sometimes disputed because of the way his letters were later published and promoted. Still, historians generally agree he participated in at least 2 significant voyages to the New World between 1499 and 1502. On his first well-documented voyage, Vespucci sailed in a fleet commanded by Alonso de Ojeda in 1499 under Spanish authority. Departing from Spain, they crossed the Atlantic and made landfall on the coast of what is now Guyana or Venezuela. Vespucci's writings describe sailing along the northern coast of South America, encountering the vast mouth of the Amazon River, and noting the remarkable tidal phenomena there. They continued westward, exploring the coastline and observing the distinctive cultures and landscapes of the region. Vespucci made detailed notes on the people, fauna and geography he saw, trying to understand how these lands related to known geography and classical authorities like Ptolemy. His observations challenged the idea that these lands were simply part of Asia. He described immense rivers, unfamiliar stars in the southern sky, and a coastline that seemed to stretch far south beyond anything known in Asian geography. These details suggested that the lands Columbus had claimed as Asia might actually be something different and previously unknown to Europeans. Vespucci also participated in voyages under the Portuguese flag. In 1501, he sailed with a Portuguese expedition led by Gonçalo Coelho. Departing from Lisbon, they crossed the Atlantic to the coast of Brazil, which Portugal claimed under the Treaty of Tordesillas. Vespucci and his companions sailed far down the coast, possibly reaching as far south as present-day Patagonia. Along the way, he observed the night sky and described the Southern Cross constellation, which was invisible from Europe. He carefully recorded the length of the coastline and the signs that this landmass extended much further than anyone had realized. He concluded, based on his own observations and astronomical measurements, that these lands could not be the eastern edge of Asia. Instead, they were part of an entirely separate continent. In letters that were widely published in Europe, Vespucci described this revelation. He famously referred to it as a new world, a phrase that captured the imagination of his readers. The letters attributed to Vespucci became bestsellers of their time, translated and reprinted throughout Europe. They combined vivid descriptions of the lands and peoples he encountered with practical navigational detail and his argument that these territories were not part of Asia, but a new continent altogether. It was this interpretation, more than any particular discovery, that made Vespucci's name endure. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller produced a new world map, incorporating the latest discoveries. Impressed by Vespucci's writings and convinced of his argument for a separate continent, Waldseemüller labelled the southern part of the New World America, using the Latin version of Vespucci's first name. Though Vespucci never sought such an honour himself, the name stuck and was eventually applied to both continents. Meanwhile, Vespucci returned to Seville and remained an important figure in the administration of Spain's Atlantic interests. In 1508, he was appointed Piloto Mayor, or Chief Navigator of Spain. In this role, he oversaw the training of pilots, the production of accurate charts, and the standardization of navigational knowledge for voyages to the New World. This position shows the respect he commanded among his contemporaries for his expertise in navigation and geography, even if debates continued about the details of his travels. Vespucci spent his last years in Seville, managing these responsibilities and maintaining correspondence with other explorers and officials. He died there on February 22nd, 1512. Though he never commanded grand colonial ventures like Columbus or conquered empires like Cortés, his legacy was immense. Amerigo Vespucci was not the first European to reach the Americas, nor did he discover new lands unknown to the native peoples who lived there. But through his careful observations, measurements, and written accounts, he helped his contemporaries understand that these lands were not Asia, but a previously unknown continent. His letters spread this idea widely, reshaping European understanding of the world's geography. His name endures on the maps of today, a testament to his role in one of humanity's greatest shifts in knowledge. Amerigo Vespucci stands as a figure whose explorations were not simply about claiming land, but about expanding the very horizons of what Europe understood about the shape and scope of the world itself. Next, we have John Cabot, who led England's first voyage to North America, staking a claim on a new world. John Cabot was born around 1450 in Genoa, or possibly Gaeta in Italy, though precise records of his early life are scarce. His Italian name was Giovanni Caboto. He grew up in a bustling maritime world at the height of the Italian Renaissance, surrounded by traders, sailors, and merchants who carried stories of distant lands and opportunities for wealth. Genoa, in particular, was a city that thrived on seaborne trade, its people accustomed to navigating complex networks of commerce stretching across the Mediterranean. As a young man, Cabot is believed to have moved to Venice, where he became a citizen by 1476. Gaining Venetian citizenship was no small achievement, indicating that he had settled there for at least 15 years and had earned the trust of local authorities. Venice was one of Europe's most important maritime republics, its merchants competing with rivals from Genoa, Florence, and other city-states for access to Eastern trade. In this environment, Cabot learned the essential skills of navigation, map reading, and ship management, and he worked as a merchant trading goods throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Despite these opportunities, Venice was increasingly squeezed by the Ottoman Empire's expansion and by Portugal's efforts to dominate the sea route around Africa. By the late 15th century, ambitious sailors across Europe were seeking new paths to Asia. Columbus's famous voyage in 1492, backed by the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, demonstrated that crossing the Atlantic might lead to new lands and untold riches. Around this time, Cabot left Italy, apparently facing debts or business difficulties, and moved to Spain and then to England. He saw in England a chance to restart his fortunes, and found a country eager to compete with Spain and Portugal's maritime successes. Henry VII, England's Tudor king, was cautious with money but open to bold proposals that might bring wealth and prestige. Cabot proposed a westward voyage to reach Asia by a northern route, one that might be shorter and less contested than Spain's southerly crossings. In 1496, Henry VII granted Cabot letters patent, authorising him and his sons to sail under the English flag, claim new lands, and hold monopolies on trade there. This document is a milestone in English exploration, marking one of the earliest royal endorsements of overseas ventures. Cabot's first attempt, likely in 1496, failed because of poor weather and insufficient supplies. Undeterred, he prepared again, this time with better planning and resources. In May 1497, he set sail from Bristol aboard a small ship called the Matthew, a vessel of around 50 tons with a crew estimated at about 18 to 20 men. The Matthew was not a large or especially sophisticated ship by the standards of the time, but it was sturdy and capable of handling the North Atlantic's challenging conditions. Cabot's route took him northwest from England, following a higher latitude than Columbus had. He believed the voyage would be shorter there because classical geography suggested the distance around the narrower northern part of the globe would be less. After several weeks at sea, battling cold winds and fog, Cabot and his crew sighted land. The exact location of his 1497 landfall is debated, but most scholars agree it was somewhere on the coast of North America, likely in what is now Newfoundland or Cape Breton Island. What is clear is that Cabot was the first known European since the Norse to reach the North American mainland. Unlike Columbus, who had landed on Caribbean islands, Cabot stood on continental shores. Cabot planted the English flag, claimed the land for Henry VII, and explored the coast for a short time. He noted the rich fishing grounds nearby, describing seas so thick with cod that they could be caught in baskets lowered over the side of the ship. These reports would later encourage European fishing ventures that transformed the North Atlantic economy. Cabot and his crew returned to England in August 1497. The voyage had taken only a few months, and despite its modest scale, it was a triumph. He was welcomed in England as the Great Admiral, and Henry VII rewarded him with a pension of £20 per year, a sign of royal favour and an incentive to continue. In 1498, Cabot organised a second expedition with at least 5 ships, possibly larger and better equipped. Their plan was to explore further, establish trade, and perhaps find a route to Asia itself. However, the fate of this expedition is shrouded in mystery. The fleet departed Bristol in May or June 1498. One ship was forced to land in Ireland because of damage, but the others continued west. After that, no definitive records describe what happened. Some reports suggest that Cabot may have reached North America again, exploring further south along the coast. Others suggest that his ships were lost at sea. A payment to his widow in 1499 suggests that by then he was presumed dead. It remains one of the early age of discovery's unsolved mysteries. Though his life ended in uncertainty, Cabot's legacy was clear. His 1497 voyage gave England its first documented claim to lands in the New World. This claim would be invoked more than a century later to justify English colonisation of North America. Cabot's exploration also encouraged England to see itself as a seafaring nation, capable of competing with Spain and Portugal on the global stage. John Cabot's voyages were small in scale but monumental in impact. He was driven by the dream of finding a western route to Asia, but instead he revealed the vast northern coasts of a new continent to Europe. His landfalls and claims set in motion centuries of English expansion, trade and settlement in North America. Cabot himself remains a somewhat shadowy figure, an Italian in English service who blended Renaissance curiosity with practical seamanship. His life embodies the daring, the ambition, and the human costs of Europe's age of exploration, a man whose vision carried him across an ocean to shores no one in his world had seen for centuries, leaving behind a legacy that would shape the modern world. Next, we have the explorer who led the first voyage to circle the globe, proving the true size of the world, Ferdinand Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan was born around 1480 in northern Portugal, likely in the small town of Sabrosa in the province of Trás-os-Montes. He came from a minor noble family, his father Rui de Magalhães serving as an administrator for the Portuguese crown. From a young age, Magellan was shaped by Portugal's maritime culture, growing up during the height of the Age of Discovery, when Portuguese sailors were pushing further down the African coast and reaching the far side of the Indian Ocean. As a boy, Magellan entered the royal court in Lisbon as a page, where he received education in navigation, astronomy, cartography, and the maritime arts that were transforming European understanding of the world. He would have heard first-hand reports from returning sailors about voyages around Africa to India and to the fabled Spice Islands, the Moluccas in modern Indonesia, which produced highly valued cloves, nutmeg, and other spices that were worth fortunes in European markets. By the early 1500s, Magellan was serving in the Portuguese navy. In 1505, he joined the armada of Francisco de Almeida, the first viceroy of Portuguese India. He sailed to East Africa and India, participating in Portugal's efforts to establish fortified trading posts and dominate the Indian Ocean's lucrative trade routes. In 1509, he fought in the Battle of Diu, where Portuguese forces defeated a coalition of Indian, Arab and Egyptian fleets, securing Portugal's naval supremacy in the region. Magellan's service continued with voyages to Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, a key trading hub. Around 1511, he took part in the Portuguese conquest of Malacca, helping to secure a crucial link in the trade route to the Spice Islands. It is believed that during these expeditions, Magellan heard detailed accounts from local pilots about routes east of Malacca to the fabled islands rich in spices. These experiences deepened his knowledge of the region and planted the seeds of his later ambitions. Despite his experience and service, Magellan's relationship with the Portuguese crown soured. He was accused of irregular conduct during campaigns in Morocco, where he was wounded in battle and felt that he was treated unjustly when denied further royal favour or pension. Disillusioned, he left Portugal in 1517 and offered his services to Spain, Portugal's fierce maritime rival. Spain at that time was determined to break Portugal's monopoly on the spice trade. The Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494 had divided the non-European world between Portugal and Spain along a meridian, granting Portugal claim to routes around Africa to Asia. Magellan proposed that the Spice Islands might actually lie within Spain's half of the world if approached by sailing west. He claimed he could reach them by finding a passage through the Americas, providing Spain with a western route to these riches. Magellan and his cosmographer, Rui Falero, gained the support of King Charles I of Spain, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. In 1518, Charles granted them authority to outfit an expedition, granting Magellan the titles of Captain General and Adelantado over any lands he might discover. In September 1519, Magellan set sail from Seville with a fleet of 5 ships: the Trinidad, his flagship, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago. The fleet carried over 250 men of various nationalities, a testament to Spain's diverse empire. Their goal was to find a strait through South America leading to the South Sea, as Balboa had called the Pacific Ocean, and to sail on to the Spice Islands. The voyage faced challenges from the start. Crossing the Atlantic, they resupplied at the Canary Islands and reached the coast of South America at what is now Brazil. They sailed south along the coast, probing for inlets that might be the elusive passage. As the southern winter approached, Magellan ordered the fleet to overwinter at Puerto San Julian in Patagonia. There, tensions erupted. Facing cold, hunger, and fear of the unknown, some of Magellan's Spanish captains mutinied, arguing that they should turn back. Magellan acted decisively and ruthlessly. He crushed the mutiny, executing one leader and marooning another. His determination held the expedition together, but also sowed deep divisions among the officers. In the spring of 1520, they continued southward. The Santiago was lost on a reconnaissance mission, wrecked in a storm. Finally, in October 1520, they found a complex winding passage at the southern tip of the continent. This would later be named the Strait of Magellan in his honour. The crossing was treacherous, marked by icy winds, rocky channels and confusion. At one point the San Antonio deserted and returned to Spain. Emerging from the strait in November, Magellan and his remaining ships sailed into the vast unknown ocean he named the Pacific, for its apparent calmness compared to the Atlantic. But the voyage across the Pacific was anything but easy. They underestimated its size, leading to a grueling crossing of more than 3 months with virtually no fresh food or water. Many of the crew died of scurvy and starvation, gnawing on leather and sawdust to survive. At last, they reached the islands of Guam in March 1521, where they could rest and resupply. Continuing west, they arrived in the Philippines, where Magellan established alliances with local rulers. However, his attempts to convert them to Christianity and draw them into Spanish allegiance led to conflict. On April 27, 1521, Magellan was killed in the Battle of Mactan, fighting against the forces of the local chieftain Lapu-Lapu. His death marked the end of his personal journey but not of his fleets. Command of the expedition fell to others, including Juan Sebastián Elcano. Under extreme hardship and with only one surviving ship, the Victoria, they continued westward across the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and finally returned to Spain in September 1522. This voyage became the first known circumnavigation of the globe, proving conclusively that the Earth was round on a practical navigable scale, and that the world's oceans were connected. Though Magellan did not live to see its completion, his vision, leadership, and sheer determination made it possible. He had charted the strait that bears his name, opened the Pacific to European exploration, and demonstrated the scale of the planet in a way that forever changed geography and navigation. Magellan's legacy is complex. He was a master navigator and bold leader, but also a harsh disciplinarian, and a man whose ambitions drew him into deadly conflicts with the people he encountered. His expedition reshaped global trade, politics, and understanding, setting the stage for centuries of European imperialism and exchange. Remembered today as one of the greatest maritime explorers, Ferdinand Magellan stands as a symbol of the Age of Discovery's extraordinary achievements and its enduring consequences, a man whose relentless pursuit of a western route to Asia redrew the map of the world. Next, we have Hernán Cortés, the explorer who led the expedition that brought down an empire and changed Mexico forever. Hernán Cortés was born in 1485 in the town of Medellín, in the province of Extremadura in Spain. He was born into a family of minor nobility. His father, Martín Cortés de Monroy, was a hidalgo, a gentleman of limited means but noble lineage. His mother, Catalina Pizarro Altamirano, also came from a family of modest noble status. Though not wealthy, the family was respectable and ensured young Hernán received an education. As a boy, he was sent to study law at the University of Salamanca, one of Spain's leading centres of learning. Yet Cortés was restless, and after only 2 years he abandoned his studies, drawn instead to the opportunities and adventure that beckoned from Spain's new overseas colonies. By the early 16th century, Spain was building an empire in the Caribbean. Tales of gold, fertile lands, and native peoples ripe for conversion drew thousands of ambitious young men from Spain's provinces. Around 1504, Cortés sailed to Hispaniola, the first major Spanish settlement in the Americas. There he worked as a notary, gaining practical experience in colonial administration and developing connections with other settlers and officials. He acquired land and a small measure of wealth, but never settled entirely into the role of planter or bureaucrat. Cortés's ambitions soon drew him to military ventures. In 1511, he joined the expedition led by Diego Velázquez that conquered Cuba for Spain. He was rewarded with land and indigenous labourers under the encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers control over local people in exchange for their Christianization. Cortés became a prominent figure in Cuban colonial society and gained the trust, if not always the friendship, of Governor Velázquez himself. It was in Cuba that plans began to form for exploring and potentially conquering the lands to the west, the mainland of Mexico. Early expeditions under Francisco Hernández de Córdoba and Juan de Grijalva returned with tantalizing accounts of rich and complex indigenous civilizations and rumors of immense wealth. Seeing opportunity, Velázquez began organizing a more ambitious expedition and initially chose Cortés to command it. But Velázquez grew wary of Cortés's independent streak and attempted to revoke his commission at the last minute. Cortés, however, acted quickly and decisively. In early 1519, he sailed anyway, defying the governor's orders and committing himself fully to the venture. He departed Cuba with a small fleet of 11 ships, around 500 soldiers, 100 sailors, a few cannons and horses, far from a massive army, but formidable given the context of the time. Crossing the Yucatan Channel, Cortés first landed on the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, where he received valuable intelligence and interpreters. Among them was Geronimo de Aguilar, a Spanish castaway who had learned Maya, and later Malintzin, also known as La Malinche, a Nahua woman who spoke both Nahuatl and Maya. Through these interpreters, Cortés could communicate with the peoples of Mexico. Malintzin became indispensable as both translator and advisor, shaping negotiations and diplomacy. He then sailed north to the coast of what is now Veracruz. There he founded the town of Villarrica de la Vera Cruz, a legal maneuver that allowed him to establish authority independent of Velázquez by claiming to act directly under the authority of King Charles I of Spain. He persuaded his men to renounce allegiance to Velázquez, securing their loyalty to his cause. In a dramatic gesture to prevent retreat, Cortés ordered the scuttling of his ships, forcing his men to commit fully to the inland expedition. Marching inland, Cortés confronted the powerful and complex political landscape of central Mexico. He forged alliances with indigenous groups who opposed the Aztec Empire's dominance, most notably the Tlaxcalans. While initial encounters with Tlaxcalans were violent, he negotiated a crucial alliance that brought thousands of indigenous warriors into his ranks. These alliances were vital, offering not only military strength but also intelligence about local terrain, politics, and Aztec tactics. In November 1519, Cortés and his allied forces arrived at the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, an astonishing city of canals, temples, and markets built on an island in Lake Texcoco. They were welcomed by the Aztec ruler Moctezuma II, who faced a complex dilemma. He recognized the Spaniards' military power, but also saw them as potential allies, or even divine emissaries, according to some interpretations of Aztec prophecy. Cortés and his men were housed in the city and treated with deference, but tensions soon mounted. Cortés, understanding both the opportunity and danger, seized Moctezuma as a hostage in his own palace, seeking to control the city through its emperor. The delicate balance collapsed when a Spanish garrison massacred Aztec nobles during a religious festival, igniting a massive uprising. The Spaniards found themselves besieged, and Moctezuma was killed under contested circumstances. Whether by his own people or at Spanish hands remains debated. In the summer of 1520, Cortés and his allies attempted a desperate retreat during the chaotic Noche Triste, or Night of Sorrows, suffering heavy casualties as they fled the city across causeways under relentless attack. Yet Cortés regrouped. He rebuilt his alliances, strengthened his forces, and returned to lay siege to Tenochtitlan in 1521. After months of brutal fighting, starvation, and disease that devastated the Aztec population, the city fell. The destruction was immense, and with it, the Aztec Empire effectively ended. Cortés claimed the lands for Spain, establishing Mexico City on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. He sent vast quantities of tribute, gold, and precious artifacts back to Spain, fueling European imaginations about the riches of the New World. Though he was recognized by King Charles I, he faced continual challenges from royal administrators sent to limit his power, jealous rivals, and court politics that questioned the brutality of his methods. He was appointed Captain General of New Spain, but eventually saw his authority curtailed. He returned to Spain more than once to defend his reputation and seek royal favour. In his later years, he participated in an expedition to Honduras and explored parts of Baja California, but these ventures did not match the scale or impact of his conquest of Mexico. Cortés spent his final years embroiled in lawsuits over land, titles, and debts. Though wealthy and famous, he felt embittered by what he saw as a lack of proper recognition. He died in Spain in 1547 near Seville. Hernán Cortés remains one of history's most controversial figures. To some, he was a brilliant strategist and daring adventurer who toppled one of the world's great empires with a small force. To others, he embodied the violence, greed, and devastation that European conquest brought to the Americas. His alliance building, military tactics, and ruthless determination enabled him to change the course of history, but at a cost of immense suffering for indigenous peoples. His life stands as a stark illustration of the Age of Exploration's dual legacy, an era of discovery and encounter that was also one of conquest and colonization, whose consequences continue to shape the world today. Next, we have the explorer who circled the globe as a privateer, striking fear into the heart of an empire, Sir Francis Drake. Sir Francis Drake was born around 1540 in Tavistock, a market town in Devon, England. He was the eldest of 12 sons born to Edmund Drake, a tenant farmer and Protestant preacher. His family's fortunes were modest, and when Francis was a boy, they fled to Kent to escape religious persecution during the reign of Mary I, who sought to restore Catholicism in England. Growing up on the banks of the River Medway, Francis became immersed in the maritime world that would define his life. As a young man, Drake was apprenticed to the captain of a small coastal trading vessel. He quickly proved himself capable, learning the arts of navigation, ship handling and commerce in England's bustling and dangerous waters. By his early 20s, he had command of his own small ship, a humble start for someone who would become one of the most famous mariners of his age. England at this time was emerging as a Protestant power under Elizabeth I, competing with Catholic Spain for dominance on the seas and in the New World. The Spanish had claimed vast territories in the Americas and jealously guarded their trade and shipping routes. English mariners, many of them privateers, essentially state-sanctioned pirates, saw Spain's wealth as a target. In the early 1560s, Drake joined his cousin John Hawkins on slaving voyages to West Africa and the Caribbean. These expeditions were brutal ventures that raided African communities to capture and sell enslaved people in Spanish colonies. They also faced fierce resistance from Spanish authorities, who saw these incursions as illegal and provocative. On a 1568 voyage, the English fleet was cornered at San Juan de Ulua in Mexico, where the Spanish attacked them under a flag of truce. Drake narrowly escaped with his life, and the experience left him with a lifelong hatred of Spain. In the years that followed, Drake turned to privateering with renewed determination. He launched raids against Spanish ports and shipping in the Caribbean, operating with unofficial support from English investors eager for profit and from Queen Elizabeth herself, who wanted to weaken Spain without formal war. By the mid-1570s, Drake had established himself as a formidable captain and navigator. His most famous expedition began in 1577, when he set out from Plymouth at the head of a small fleet, officially tasked with trading in the Pacific, but in reality preparing to raid Spanish holdings and seek a passage around South America. His flagship was the Pelican, later renamed the Golden Hind. Sailing down the coast of Africa and across the Atlantic, Drake reached the coast of South America. He navigated the treacherous Strait of Magellan in 1578, becoming only the second European expedition to do so after Magellan's own voyage decades earlier. Emerging into the Pacific, Drake faced fierce storms that scattered his fleet and forced him to abandon hopes of reuniting with his other ships. Undeterred, he continued up the Pacific coast of South America with just the Golden Hind. He raided Spanish ports in what are now Chile and Peru, capturing enormous amounts of treasure and disrupting Spain's sense of security in their American empire. His most famous prize was the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, nicknamed the Cacafuego, a richly laden galleon he seized off the coast of Ecuador, filled with gold, silver, jewels, and precious goods. After these raids, Drake sailed further north along the Pacific coast, possibly reaching as far as modern-day Northern California. He claimed this land for England, naming it Nova Albion, though the exact location remains debated. He repaired the Golden Hind there and considered seeking the fabled Northwest Passage, a hoped-for sea route through North America back to the Atlantic, but found no such passage and turned west across the Pacific. Crossing the Pacific was a feat in itself, and Drake navigated the vast ocean to reach the Moluccas, the fabled Spice Islands in modern Indonesia. He traded with local rulers for valuable spices like cloves and navigated dangerous reefs and shoals in the region. From there he continued through the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and sailed up the west coast of Africa, finally returning to England in September 1580. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe was only the second successful one in history after Magellan's expedition. He was welcomed as a hero. Queen Elizabeth I boarded the Golden Hind and personally knighted him on its deck in 1581. The treasure he brought back enriched his backers many times over, and his voyage cemented his reputation as both a daring explorer and a scourge of Spanish shipping. Yet Drake's career did not end with exploration. He became one of England's most famous privateers and naval commanders. During the 1580s, he led devastating raids on Spanish ports in the Caribbean, famously singeing the King of Spain's beard in 1587 by attacking the Spanish fleet at Cadiz and delaying the launch of the Spanish Armada. When the Armada finally sailed in 1588, Drake served as Vice Admiral of the English fleet. He helped orchestrate the strategy of using fireships to scatter the Spanish formation and contributed to the defeat that marked a turning point in the long rivalry between England and Spain. In his later years, Drake returned to the Caribbean for further campaigns against Spanish holdings. His final expedition in 1595 was less successful. Disease ravaged his fleet, and he failed to capture his major objectives. He died of dysentery off the coast of Portobello in Panama in January 1596. According to accounts, he was buried at sea in a lead-lined coffin, still in armour, off the Caribbean coast he had raided so many times. Drake's legacy is complex and deeply contested. In England, he was celebrated as a hero, a daring navigator who defied Spain, circumnavigated the globe, and helped establish England as a maritime power. In Spain, he was reviled as a pirate and corsair whose raids brought terror and destruction to their colonies and shipping. Beyond the legend lies the man, a skilled seaman, shrewd strategist, and relentless opportunist who combined exploration with privateering, commerce with warfare. His life illuminates the brutal, ambitious, and adventurous spirit of the Age of Exploration, a time of remarkable voyages that opened the world to global exchange, but also unleashed violence, conquest, and exploitation on an unprecedented scale. Sir Francis Drake remains one of the most vivid symbols of that age, a man whose name is forever linked with both the promise and the peril of exploration. Next, we have James Cook, the explorer who charted the last unknown coasts, bringing the Pacific's secrets to the world. James Cook was born on October 27th, 1728, in the small village of Marton in Yorkshire, England. He was the second of 8 children born to Grace and James Cook, a Scottish farm labourer who worked his way up to become a farm manager. Though his family was of modest means, they valued hard work and education. Young James attended the local school in Great Ayton until the age of 16, showing a gift for mathematics and a fascination with the natural world. At 16, Cook was apprenticed to a shopkeeper in the fishing village of Staithes. He worked there for about 18 months, but he found himself restless, drawn more to the sea than to the shop counter. Recognising his ambition, his employer released him from his indenture, and in 1746 Cook moved to Whitby, where he was apprenticed to the Quaker shipowners John and Henry Walker. It was here, aboard their coal ships, that he truly learned seamanship, sailing along the treacherous North Sea coast, handling heavy cargoes, and gaining the skills that would one day take him around the world. After completing his apprenticeship in 1755, Cook had the opportunity to command a merchant ship, but instead he volunteered for the Royal Navy, just as Britain was preparing for conflict in what would become the 7 Years' War. His choice was bold, sacrificing short-term security for a chance at adventure and advancement. He quickly proved himself capable, rising from able seaman to master, responsible for navigation and handling of ships. During the war, Cook's talents came to the fore. He served aboard HMS Pembroke in North America, where his precise surveys of the St. Lawrence River were critical to the successful British assault on Quebec in 1759. His reputation as a skilled surveyor and cartographer grew, and after the war he continued charting the rugged coasts of Newfoundland. His charts were so accurate they remained in use for over a century, showcasing not only his technical skill but his patience and rigorous attention to detail. It was this reputation that led the Admiralty and the Royal Society to select Cook to command an extraordinary scientific voyage. By the 1760s, Europe's scientific community was eager to observe the 1769 transit of Venus across the Sun, an event that would allow for better calculations of the Earth's distance from the Sun. The chosen observation site was Tahiti, then only recently visited by European explorers. But the expedition had a second secret goal: to seek the fabled Terra Australis Incognita, the supposed Great Southern Continent. Cook was given command of HMS Endeavour, a sturdy Whitby collier refitted for exploration. He sailed in 1768 with a team that included astronomer Charles Green and the naturalists Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander. They arrived in Tahiti in April 1769 and successfully observed the transit of Venus. Cook managed relations with Tahitians carefully, navigating a complex web of trade, diplomacy, and occasional conflict, while also respecting local customs and securing provisions. After leaving Tahiti, Cook opened the sealed orders instructing him to search for the southern continent. He sailed south, reaching latitudes cold and inhospitable, finding no vast landmass. Instead, he turned west and discovered New Zealand. Over 6 months, he and his crew meticulously charted both islands' coastlines, proving that they were not part of a larger southern continent. From New Zealand, Cook sailed west, reaching the east coast of Australia in April 1770. He became the first recorded European to make landfall on Australia's eastern shore, at a place he named Botany Bay, in honour of the rich plant specimens collected by Banks and Solander. Cook and his crew charted over 2,000 miles of Australia's coastline, navigating treacherous reefs and shoals along the Great Barrier Reef, at one point nearly losing the Endeavour when it ran aground. After repairs in Batavia, present-day Jakarta, the Endeavour returned to England in 1771. Cook was celebrated for his achievements, having expanded the known world and dramatically improved its mapping. But he had also brought home detailed observations of indigenous cultures, flora, fauna, and geography, laying groundwork for future European colonisation. In 1772, Cook embarked on his second voyage, this time commanding HMS Resolution, with Tobias Furneaux in command of the companion ship HMS Adventure. His mission was clear: to settle the question of Terra Australis Incognita once and for all. Over 3 years, Cook sailed further south than any previous navigator, crossing the Antarctic Circle and proving conclusively that no habitable southern continent existed in temperate latitudes. This voyage also took him through the South Pacific, where he visited and charted many islands, including Easter Island, Tonga, and the New Hebrides, now Vanuatu. He paid particular attention to the health of his crew, pioneering measures to prevent scurvy through a diet including sauerkraut and other preserved foods. His insistence on hygiene and nutrition saved countless lives and revolutionized naval medicine. After returning to England in 1775, Cook was widely respected as the foremost navigator of his age. Yet he was not done. In 1776 he accepted command of a third voyage, this time tasked with finding the Northwest Passage from the Pacific side. Sailing once again in the Resolution, with Charles Clark commanding the Discovery, Cook headed for the Pacific via the Cape of Good Hope. This final voyage took Cook to familiar places like New Zealand and Tahiti, before pushing north to the Hawaiian Islands, which he became the first European to map comprehensively. He named them the Sandwich Islands in honour of the Earl of Sandwich, the First Lord of the Admiralty. From Hawaii, Cook sailed to the North American west coast, exploring and charting it from present-day Oregon to Alaska. He entered the Bering Strait seeking a navigable passage to the Atlantic, but was blocked by impenetrable ice. He returned to Hawaii in 1779 for repairs and supplies. Relations with the Hawaiians, initially friendly, became strained on this second visit. After a series of disputes over thefts and cultural misunderstandings, tensions boiled over. On February 14, 1779, during a confrontation at Kealakekwa Bay, Cook was killed in a chaotic skirmish. Accounts suggest he tried to mediate, but the situation spiraled out of control. His body was treated according to Hawaiian funerary traditions, and parts were returned to his crew. Though he did not complete the Northwest Passage, Cook's legacy was immense. He had circumnavigated the globe multiple times, charted vast stretches of previously unmapped coastlines with remarkable accuracy, and improved the art and science of navigation. His encounters with indigenous peoples were complex, sometimes respectful and curious, sometimes marked by violence and misunderstanding. Cook's voyages reshaped Europe's understanding of the Pacific world and set the stage for future imperial expansion and colonization. They also brought detailed knowledge of the region's cultures and natural history to European audiences. His charts were so precise that many were used well into the 19th century. James Cook remains one of history's most renowned explorers, a man whose rigorous methods, determination, and skill expanded the known world, but whose voyages also heralded profound changes for the peoples and places he encountered. His life tells the story of exploration at its most ambitious and its most consequential, embodying both the spirit of discovery and the complexities of cultural encounter. Next, we have the woman who guided Lewis and Clark across a continent, bridging worlds with every step, Sacagawea. Sacagawea was born around 1788 in what is now Idaho, into the Lemhi Shoshone people. She spent her early childhood among her family in the Rocky Mountain region, learning the skills and traditions that had sustained her people for generations: how to gather roots and berries, prepare food, make clothing, and navigate the river valleys and mountain passes that defined their world. The Lemhi Shoshone were a small mobile band, constantly balancing trade and alliance with neighbouring tribes, with the ever-present threat of conflict. When Sacagawea was around 12 years old, her life changed dramatically. During a raid by a Hidatsa war party, enemies of the Shoshone, she was captured along with other young people. She was taken east hundreds of miles to a Hidatsa Mandan village near the confluence of the Knife and Missouri rivers in what is now North Dakota. There she was effectively enslaved and absorbed into Hidatsa life. For years she lived among them, learning their language and customs, while never forgetting her Shoshone roots or her family left behind in the mountains. It was in this village that she met Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trader who had taken up residence with the Hidatsa. Charbonneau acquired Sacagawea, Accounts vary on whether he won her in gambling, purchased her, or married her after she was forced to become his wife. She was still a teenager when she became one of his 2 young wives. Around 1804 she was pregnant with her first child. This remote village was far from the centres of American settlement, but it had become an important trading hub for French, British, and American traders who wanted to tap into the rich fur resources of the northern plains. It was here that the Lewis and Clark expedition arrived in the winter of 1804 to 1805. Sent by President Thomas Jefferson after the Louisiana Purchase, the Corps of Discovery was charged with exploring the vast new territory, mapping it, and finding a practical route to the Pacific Ocean. They also aimed to establish American presence before European powers could do the same, and to make contact with native nations along the way. At Fort Mandan, their winter camp, Lewis and Clark hired Charbonneau as an interpreter, largely because of Sacagawea. Unlike her husband, Sacagawea spoke Shoshone, and the expedition knew they would need to negotiate for horses once they reached the Rocky Mountains. Without horses, crossing the mountains would be impossible. Her inclusion was not simply a convenience, but a necessity for the expedition's success. Sacagawea gave birth to her son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, in February 1805. Only weeks later, she and the infant joined the Corps of Discovery as it set out in April 1805, travelling by pirogue and canoe up the Missouri River. This image, a young Shoshone woman paddling upriver with her baby on her back, is one of the most enduring symbols of the American frontier. Her contributions to the expedition were significant and multifaceted. As they travelled west, she recognized familiar landmarks along the Missouri, confirming to the explorers that they were on the correct route. She helped identify edible and medicinal plants, such as wild artichokes and berries, providing essential nutrition and variety to the men's diet. She also served as a translator and negotiator when they encountered native groups, notably when the expedition met a Shoshone band led by her brother Cameawait. This moment in August 1805 was extraordinary. Sacagawea had been separated from her family since childhood, and in the midst of tense negotiations for horses, she realized the Shoshone leader was her own brother. Her presence transformed the encounter. The Shoshone were wary of the armed white men seeking passage, but Sacagawea's reunion with her brother built trust and cemented an agreement to trade horses and supplies. Without this exchange, the expedition might well have failed to cross the mountains before winter. Sacagawea also helped calm fears among other native nations the Corps met. A group of armed men with a woman and baby was clearly not a war party. Her very presence signalled peaceful intentions. She was a cultural mediator as much as a guide. Crossing the Bitterroot Mountains via the Lolo Trail was among the expedition's hardest challenges. The party suffered from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Sacagawea shared in these hardships, carrying her infant through freezing nights and scarce food. When the expedition reached the Nez Perce, she again helped in building connections with local leaders, whose aid was critical in resupplying the expedition and providing knowledge of the route west. Upon reaching the Pacific, Sacagawea took part in the decision-making of the Corps when they voted on where to build their winter camp at Fort Clatsop, an act that stands out in history for including her and York, William Clark's enslaved African-American servant, as participants in the deliberation. She spent that winter of 1805 to 1806 near the cold, wet Oregon coast, caring for Jean-Baptiste while assisting the expedition's daily survival. The return journey in 1806 brought its own challenges. On the way back, Sacagawea helped navigate through familiar country, recognizing landmarks and guiding them to passes through the mountains. She advocated for a specific route, known today as Bozeman Pass, which the Corps used to cross from the Yellowstone to the Missouri River drainage. When the expedition returned to the Hidatsa Mandan villages in August 1806, Sacagawea and her family parted ways with Lewis and Clark. She received nothing official from the US government at the time, though her husband was paid for his services. Yet her role was recognized in Lewis and Clark's journals with gratitude and respect. Little is known with certainty about her life afterward. Records indicate she and Charbonneau lived for a time at Fort Manuel Lisa, a trading post in present-day South Dakota. She may have died there in 1812, possibly of illness following the birth of a daughter. However, some oral traditions among the Shoshone hold that she left Charbonneau, returned to her people, and lived to an old age, dying in the Wind River country in 1884. Historians generally consider the 1812 date more likely, but the true end of her story remains debated. Sacagawea's son, Jean-Baptiste, was taken to St. Louis at William Clark's invitation, where he was educated and went on to travel in Europe before returning to the American West as a guide and trader himself, a testament to the lasting connections forged during that epic journey. Sacagawea's legacy has grown far beyond the details of her brief life. She has come to symbolize the resilience, skill, and quiet strength of indigenous women in American history. Her role in the Lewis and Clark expedition was indispensable, not as a mere guide, but as a cultural broker, interpreter, and peacemaker who helped open a continent while carrying her child on her back. Her story reminds us that exploration was never solely about European ambitions or maps drawn on parchment. It was also about the knowledge, relationships, and humanity of the native peoples who lived on these lands for generations. Sacagawea's life stands as a testament to that deeper, often overlooked truth of American history. Next, we have Nellie Bly, the explorer who raced around the world and exposed hidden truths, redefining what a reporter could be. Nellie Bly was born Elizabeth Jane Cochran on May 5, 1864, in Cochran's Mills, a small town in western Pennsylvania that bore her family's name. She was the daughter of Michael Cochran, a prosperous mill owner and judge. Her early years were marked by relative comfort and security, but her childhood took a stark turn when her father died suddenly, without a will when she was only 6. This left the family in financial hardship, and Elizabeth learned early about the precarity many women faced when left without legal or economic power. As a teenager, she attended boarding school for a time but had to withdraw because of cost. Living in Pittsburgh with her mother, she saw firsthand the challenges facing working women, an experience that would shape her worldview. At 19, she read an article in the Pittsburgh Dispatch titled "What Girls Are Good For," which argued that women belonged in the home and were unfit for meaningful work. Outraged, she wrote a fiery response under the pseudonym Lonely Orphan Girl. Her letter so impressed the editor that he offered her a job, the start of a remarkable career in journalism under the name Nellie Bly, inspired by a Stephen Foster song. At the Dispatch, Bly quickly made a name for herself by refusing to write the usual women's page fare of fashion and society gossip. Instead, she focused on social issues affecting working women, writing about factory conditions and the plight of female labourers. Her bold approach upset advertisers, and she was eventually reassigned to society reporting, a move she resisted by leaving the paper to travel to Mexico in 1886. At just 21, she spent several months as a foreign correspondent in Mexico, sending back vivid critical reports on poverty, government corruption, and the daily lives of ordinary Mexicans. When her reporting displeased the Mexican authorities, she had to flee the country. Her experiences there became the basis for her first book, 6 Months in Mexico, showcasing her courage and willingness to cross borders, literally and journalistically, to expose injustice. Returning to the United States, Bly sought greater challenges and moved to New York City in 1887. She faced months of rejection before managing to talk her way into the offices of Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. She proposed a daring assignment: to investigate the conditions of the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island by going undercover as a patient. To prepare, she practiced looking disoriented and troubled in boarding houses and on the streets. When the time came, she convincingly feigned madness, leading doctors to commit her to the asylum. For 10 days she lived among the patients, enduring cold baths, rotting food, physical abuse, and the constant terror of being truly trapped there. Her exposé, 10 Days in a Madhouse, shocked the public and brought immediate reforms, including increased funding, better inspections, and greater public scrutiny of how the mentally ill were treated. This undercover work revolutionized investigative journalism. Bly proved that a reporter could use disguise and immersion to reveal hidden truths, putting herself at great personal risk to tell stories others ignored. She continued to tackle social injustice with undercover investigations into factories, jails, and employment agencies, giving a voice to the voiceless and challenging the powerful. But perhaps her most famous feat of exploration came in 1889. Inspired by Jules Verne's novel Around the World in 80 Days, Bly proposed to her editors that she could beat that fictional time in real life. She set off from Hoboken, New Jersey, on November 14th, 1889, travelling alone with just a single small bag for essentials. Her journey was a marvel of planning, persistence, and adaptability. She travelled by steamship across the Atlantic to England, by train through France, and by ship through the Suez Canal to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. She continued through Singapore and Hong Kong, navigating colonial outposts and international ports with curiosity and determination. Along the way, she cabled dispatches home, maintaining a keen eye for local customs, technology, and human stories, all while managing tight connections and unpredictable delays. In Hong Kong, she learned that another journalist, Elizabeth Bisland, had set out in the opposite direction in a race to beat her time. Undaunted, Bly pressed on across the Pacific, arriving in San Francisco despite stormy seas and delays. Pulitzer chartered a special train to rush her across the United States, and she arrived back in New York on January 25, 1890. She had circled the globe in just 72 days, 6 hours, and 11 minutes, a triumph of both human will and modern transportation. Her journey made her a global celebrity. It was not only a feat of endurance and logistics, but a profound statement about what women could accomplish in an age that insisted on their limitations. She published around the world in 72 days, blending adventure narrative with social observation and solidifying her place in popular imagination as the era's most famous woman traveller. After this high point, Bly's career evolved. She married millionaire industrialist Robert Seaman in 1895 and largely retired from journalism for a time to help manage his ironclad manufacturing company. She became one of the country's first female industrialists, patenting several inventions related to oil containers and improving factory conditions. After Seaman's death in 1904, she tried to keep the business afloat but eventually lost control due to fraud by executives. During World War I, Bly returned to journalism, working as a correspondent from the Eastern Front. She reported from Austria and Serbia, offering vivid accounts of wartime suffering and refugee crises. She remained deeply committed to telling the stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. Nellie Bly died in New York City on January 27, 1922, of pneumonia. She was 57 years old. Though her life was not long, it was immensely full, defined by a fearless commitment to uncovering truth, challenging injustice, and pushing the boundaries of what women were told they could do. Her legacy is rich and complex. She's remembered as a pioneer of investigative journalism, as an adventurer who proved a woman could travel the world alone, and as a relentless advocate for society's most vulnerable. Her work transformed both journalism and public understanding, demonstrating that real exploration is not just about mapping distant lands, but about shedding light on hidden realities. Nellie Bly's life stands as a testament to courage, curiosity, and compassion. she journeyed across continents, into asylums, and through the hidden corners of her own society, always with the determination to see clearly and to tell the truth, no matter the cost. Next, we the man who conquered the coldest frontiers, becoming the first to reach both poles, Roald Amundsen. Roald Amundsen was born on July 16th, 1872, on a family farm near Sarpsborg in southeastern Norway. He was the youngest of 4 brothers in a family with deep ties to the sea. His father, Jens Amundsen, was a shipowner and captain who traded extensively, while his mother Hannah came from a well-respected local family. Growing up, Roald heard stories of Arctic voyages, sealing expeditions, and the Norwegian maritime tradition, and these tales sparked in him an early fascination with exploration and distant frozen lands. Despite his passion for adventure, Amundsen's early path was shaped by family expectations. After his father's death when Roald was just 14, his mother pressed him to study medicine. Dutifully he enrolled at the University of Oslo, but even as he sat in classrooms he was reading the accounts of explorers like Sir John Franklin and Fridtjof Nansen. When his mother died in 1893, Amundsen felt free at last to abandon medicine entirely and pursue the life of an explorer. Amundsen's first significant taste of polar adventure came in 1897, when he joined the Belgian Antarctic expedition as first mate aboard the Belgica. Led by Adriaan de Gerlache, the voyage aimed to explore parts of the Antarctic peninsula, but the ship became trapped in pack ice and drifted for over a year, making the crew the first people to endure an Antarctic winter. Conditions were brutal. Freezing temperatures, darkness, scurvy, and psychological strain. Amundsen's resourcefulness and toughness made him invaluable. He learned critical survival skills from the ship's doctor, Frederick Cook, who taught the men to eat fresh penguin and seal meat to stave off scurvy. This harrowing experience taught Amundsen that preparation, adaptability, and local knowledge, like that of Arctic peoples, were essential for survival in extreme conditions. After returning to Norway, Amundsen planned his own expedition. Inspired by the great age of polar discovery, he set his sights on mastering the Northwest Passage, the fabled sea route through the Arctic archipelago connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. He purchased a small fishing vessel, the Gjøa, which he modified for polar service. In 1903, with a tiny crew of just 6 men, Amundsen sailed from Oslo, determined not only to navigate the passage, but to conduct scientific observations of magnetic phenomena. The voyage took years. Amundsen's strategy was not to force his way through in a single season, but to winter in place and learn from the Inuit. At King William Island, he and his men stayed for nearly 2 years. During that time, they carefully studied the local Netsilik Inuit, adopting their methods of dressing in fur, building snow shelters, dog sledding, and hunting. Amundsen credited them fully for these lessons, realizing that success in the Arctic came not from imposing European ways, but from adapting to the environment as the indigenous peoples had done for centuries. In 1906, the Gjøa finally completed the Northwest Passage, becoming the first expedition to traverse it entirely by sea. Amundsen returned to Norway as a national hero, but while he had achieved a milestone that explorers had sought for centuries, his ambition was far from satisfied. He next set his sights on the North Pole, which had become the greatest prize in polar exploration. But as he planned his expedition, news broke in 1909 that both Frederick Cook and Robert Peary were claiming to have reached it first. Amundsen quietly altered his plans. He decided instead to aim for the South Pole, which remained unconquered. He kept this decision secret even from most of his own crew until they were well underway. His choice set up one of the most famous races in exploration history, against the British expedition led by Robert Falcon Scott. Amundsen's strategy was informed by everything he had learned in the Arctic, He chose to base his expedition at the Bay of Whales on the Ross Ice Shelf, closer to the pole than Scott's base at McMurdo Sound. He brought expertly trained dog teams, lighter and more flexible sleds, and used fur clothing rather than wool. Amundsen's polar party left their base camp on October 19th, 1911. The journey was meticulously planned. They established depots along the route, reducing the load they needed to carry at any one time. Their sled dogs not only hauled supplies but, when needed, were culled to feed both the men and the surviving dogs, a harsh but effective strategy Amundsen had learned from Inuit practices. Despite severe cold and the vast crevassed glaciers of the Queen Maud Mountains, Amundsen's team advanced steadily. On December 14th, 1911, he and 4 companions, Olav Bjaaland, Helmer Hansen, Sverre Hassel, and Oscar Wisting, planted the Norwegian flag at the South Pole. They carefully measured their position to ensure they had covered the area completely, leaving behind a tent with a letter for Scott confirming their achievement. Amundsen's return to base was equally efficient. He and his men covered nearly 1,800 miles in 99 days without a single casualty. In stark contrast, Scott's party reached the pole more than a month later, only to find Amundsen's flag already there, and perished on their return journey. Amundsen's success was a triumph of planning, adaptation, and respect for the knowledge of polar peoples. After this triumph, Amundsen did not rest. He turned north again, fascinated by the Arctic. He planned to drift across the North Pole in the ship Fram, the same vessel Fridtjof Nansen had used in his Arctic attempt. But the outbreak of World War I forced him to delay. After the war, he shifted strategies. In 1926, he and Italian aeronautical engineer Umberto Nobile flew over the North Pole in the airship Norge. Departing from Svalbard and flying to Alaska, they became the first confirmed team to cross the Arctic from Europe to America via the pole. Amundsen's final years were marked by financial difficulties and personal disputes. His expeditions had been costly, and he struggled to fund new ventures, yet he remained driven by the spirit of exploration. In 1928, when he learned that Nobile's airship Italia had crashed on the Arctic ice, Amundsen joined the rescue effort. On June 18, 1928, he boarded a French Latham 47 seaplane with a small crew and flew north. They were never seen again. Wreckage of the plane was later found in the Arctic Ocean, but no trace of the men was recovered. Amundsen's legacy is profound. He was the first to navigate the Northwest Passage by sea, the first to reach the South Pole, and a pioneer of polar aviation. His meticulous planning, willingness to learn from indigenous practices, and cool leadership in extreme conditions set him apart from many of his contemporaries. But his reputation is not without complexity. He was fiercely competitive, secretive about his plans, and at times ruthless in his pursuit of success. His methods, including killing sled dogs for food, have been debated for their ethical dimensions, even as they were acknowledged as practical necessities. Roald Amundsen remains one of history's greatest explorers, a man whose name is synonymous with the conquest of the most remote and hostile places on Earth. His life story is not just one of individual daring, but of adaptation, learning, and respect for the knowledge of others, a testament to human ingenuity and endurance at the very limits of the world. Next, we have the woman who ventured deep into the Middle East, revealing its hidden histories to the world, Freya Stark. Freya Stark was born on January 31, 1893 in Paris, into a family marked by art, travel, and a restless spirit. Her father, Robert Stark, was a British painter, while her mother Flora was an Italian of Anglo-German heritage, also an artist of some note. The family moved frequently between Italy, France, and England, providing Freya with a cosmopolitan upbringing, but also a sometimes chaotic and unsettled home life. Her parents' marriage eventually broke apart, leaving emotional scars that would stay with her, but also instilling in her a fierce independence that would define her life. Freya spent much of her childhood in northern Italy, in the Ligurian hills, where she grew up speaking Italian as fluently as English. She read voraciously and developed an early fascination with history and myth, especially the medieval crusades and the literature of the Middle East. Even as a girl, she dreamed of following in the footsteps of travellers she read about in dusty old books. Her formal education was interrupted by family upheaval and by illness. When she was 13, she was badly injured in an accident involving a factory machine, leaving her face permanently scarred despite repeated surgeries. Though the injury was a source of lifelong self-consciousness, it never deterred her ambition. She pursued education as best she could, studying history, languages, and literature with private tutors and at London's School of Oriental Studies, learning Arabic in particular. The First World War found her in Italy, where she volunteered as a nurse. Her experiences caring for the wounded gave her a sense of duty and adaptability. But after the war, with Europe in turmoil and options for women limited, she resolved to follow the call of exploration. Unlike the grandly funded imperial expeditions of male contemporaries, Stark travelled with little support, often on foot or donkey, guided more by curiosity than by formal mission. In 1927, at the age of 34, a time when many women were expected to be settling into domestic roles, Freya Stark made her first trip to the Middle East. She went to Lebanon and Syria, immersing herself in Arabic and wandering through ancient Crusader castles. She found there not only the landscapes of her childhood reading, but a vibrant, complicated modern world. This was the first of many journeys that would make her one of the 20th century's greatest travellers and chroniclers of the Middle East. One of her earliest notable expeditions took her deep into the Jebel Druze region of southern Syria, a mountainous area little known to outsiders. There she travelled alone or with minimal escort, building trust with local communities and recording their customs, oral histories and genealogies. She was fearless in approaching remote villages, unbothered by danger or discomfort, and she brought an unusual sensitivity to her observations. Unlike many European travellers, she sought not to dominate or exploit, but to understand. Her most famous journeys came in the 1930s in what is now Yemen. At the time, much of the Hadramaut region was uncharted by Europeans. Stark was fascinated by the ancient frankincense trade routes that crossed the harsh desert landscapes of southern Arabia. In 1934, she set out from the port of Mukalla with a small party of local guides, travelling by camel into the interior. She became the first Western woman to visit many of these towns and valleys, carefully documenting their geography, architecture, and social life. These expeditions were arduous. She faced heat, thirst, and the constant threat of tribal conflict. Negotiating safe passage required delicate diplomacy. She often relied on the courtesy of local leaders, whose trust she earned with her respect for their customs and her facility with Arabic. Her small stature and unassuming manner belied a steely determination that allowed her to overcome obstacles that would have defeated many better-funded male explorers. Stark's writings brought these remote places vividly to life for readers back in Britain and beyond. Books such as The Southern Gates of Arabia and Arabian Deserts combined precise geographic and ethnographic detail with lyrical descriptions and a deep human sympathy. She had a gift for portraying the dignity of the people she met without romanticizing them or reducing them to stereotypes. Her travels were not only feats of endurance and curiosity, but also acts of cultural mediation. She offered Europeans a more nuanced understanding of the Middle East at a time when imperial attitudes were still deeply entrenched. Yet Stark was no naive idealist. She understood the complexities and sometimes the violence of tribal politics. She was realistic about the frictions that came with modernity and colonial influence, and she tried to record them honestly. During the Second World War, Freya Stark put her linguistic and diplomatic talents to use for the British government. She worked for the Ministry of Information in Cairo and Baghdad, helping to organise propaganda efforts aimed at countering Axis influence in the Arab world. She founded the Brotherhood of Freedom, an effort to promote anti-fascist sentiment among Arab intellectuals. Her wartime work was controversial. Some saw her as a valuable cultural bridge, while others viewed her as an agent of imperial manipulation. After the war, she continued to travel widely through the Middle East, Iran and Turkey. In Iran, she explored the valleys of Luristan and the Elburz Mountains, producing some of the earliest detailed English-language accounts of those regions. She also wrote extensively about Persia's ancient history, connecting her field observations with a scholarly appreciation of the region's past. Even in old age, Stark remained indefatigable. She travelled well into her 70s and 80s, producing more than 24 books. Her memoirs, including Traveller's Prelude and Beyond Euphrates, revealed not only the landscapes she'd seen, but the emotional and intellectual journey of a woman who had lived on her own terms. Her writing was admired for its clarity, wit, and the vividness of its descriptions, earning her a place among the great travel writers of her century. Freya Stark never married, and she was open about valuing her freedom above the conventions that might have tied her down. She had close friendships and complex, sometimes difficult relationships with family and colleagues, but she prized above all the ability to go where she wished, to learn what she could, and to see the world directly. She died in 1993 at the age of 100, having witnessed a century of astonishing change. By the end of her life, the region she once travelled on foot or camel had been transformed by oil wealth, modernisation, and political upheaval. Yet her work remains a window into a moment of transition, capturing worlds on the cusp of change with an unmatched sensitivity and honesty. Freya Stark's legacy is that of a true explorer, not simply someone who mapped territory, but someone who sought to understand the people who lived there. She challenged assumptions, bridged cultural divides, and did so as a woman in a field overwhelmingly dominated by men. Her life stands as a testament to the power of curiosity, courage, and respect in exploring both the world and the human heart. Finally, we have the man who stood on the roof of the world and devoted his life to those who lived beneath it, Sir Edmund Hillary. Sir Edmund Hillary was born on July 20th, 1919, in Twakau, a small rural town south of Auckland, New Zealand. His father, Percival Hillary, had served at Gallipoli during the First World War and afterwards settled into a quiet farming life, while his mother, Gertrude, was a schoolteacher who encouraged reading and curiosity. From the start, Edmund's life was one shaped by the wide New Zealand landscape, a place of rugged mountains, rivers, and wind-swept hills that instilled in him a love of the outdoors. As a boy, Edmund was not a naturally athletic child. He was tall and thin, with a shy manner and a love of books, particularly stories of adventure and exploration. His first exposure to mountains came during a school trip to Mount Ruapehu, and it awakened something deep in him. He would later describe how the harsh cold and effort transformed him, giving him a new sense of purpose. He studied at Auckland University College, but his education was interrupted by the Second World War. He served in the Royal New Zealand Air Force as a navigator in the Pacific Theatre, flying on Catalina, flying boats. The war broadened his horizons, but also reinforced the fragility of life and the value of testing oneself against challenge. After returning from the war, Hillary joined his family in beekeeping, a profession that offered seasonal work and time in the outdoors. Summers would see him harvesting honey from hives in the rolling fields, while winters left him free to climb. He began exploring New Zealand's Southern Alps in earnest, learning ice climbing techniques, battling harsh weather, and developing the stamina and skill that would define him as a mountaineer. By the late 1940s, Hillary had become one of New Zealand's best climbers. He made a series of significant ascents in the Southern Alps, honing his ability to move quickly and safely over difficult terrain. In 1951, he joined a New Zealand party exploring the Garhwal Himalayas in India. His first exposure to the high-altitude conditions of the world's greatest mountain range. That same year, he was invited to join a British reconnaissance expedition to Mount Everest, led by Eric Shipton. The expedition did not reach the summit, but proved that the southern approach through Nepal was feasible. Hillary's strength, modesty, and relentless drive impressed the team. He returned in 1952 to attempt Cho Oyu, the sixth highest mountain in the world, but that expedition turned back short of the summit. An experience that taught him valuable lessons about altitude sickness and acclimatization. In 1953, Hillary was chosen as a key member of the British Everest expedition led by John Hunt. The mission was national in scope and ambition, backed by the Royal Geographical Society and the Alpine Club, determined to put a British-led team on the summit of the world's highest mountain. It was a complex military-style operation with dozens of climbers, Sherpas and porters, carefully establishing camps up the mountain's flanks. Hillary was paired with Tenzing Norgay, the immensely skilled Sherpa climber who'd already made numerous high-altitude ascents. Together, they formed a strong, respectful partnership. They carried supplies to stock higher camps, pushed through the treacherous Khumbu icefall, and battled the thin air of the high Himalayas. Their final camp was at over 27,000 feet, exposed to fierce winds and freezing cold. On May 29, 1953, Hillary and Tenzing launched their summit bid from their high camp. They faced the final obstacle, the now famous Hillary Step, a near-vertical rock face at 28,750 feet. Hillary led the way, cutting steps in the ice and using all his strength and skill to get them over the crux. From there, they moved steadily along the final ridge to the summit. Standing at 29,029 feet, they were the first confirmed climbers to reach the highest point on Earth. Hillary later described his reaction in characteristically understated fashion. He simply shook Tenzing's hand and then slapped him on the back. They spent only about 15 minutes on the summit, taking photographs, leaving offerings, a chocolate bar and a small cross, and looking out over the immense Himalayan landscape. Their descent was equally hazardous, but they returned safely to camp to the cheers of their fellow climbers. News of the triumph was rushed to London in time for Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, and Hillary and Tenzing became instant global heroes. Hillary was knighted by the Queen, and Tenzing received honours from the Nepalese and Indian governments. But Hillary never saw the ascent as his alone. He always credited Tenzing fully, describing their success as a team effort built on trust, shared labour, and mutual respect. He also made a point of acknowledging the critical role played by the Sherpas, who carried loads, built camps, and shared the risk every step of the way. Hillary's fame could have led to a comfortable life of celebrity. Instead, he dedicated much of his energy to helping the Sherpa people of Nepal. Through the Himalayan Trust, which he founded, he organised the building of schools, hospitals, bridges and airstrips in remote valleys. He raised money tirelessly and often returned to work alongside the local communities. He also continued exploring. He led expeditions to the South Pole as part of the 1958 Commonwealth Transantarctic Expedition, becoming one of the first to reach the pole overland since Scott and Amundsen. He also travelled to the North Pole in 1985 with astronaut Neil Armstrong, making him one of the few people to stand at both poles and the summit of Everest. Hillary's personal life included both joy and tragedy. He married Louise Rose in 1953, and they had 3 children. The family spent time in Nepal during Hillary's building projects, forging deep friendships with the local people. But in 1975, tragedy struck when Louise and their daughter Belinda were killed in a plane crash in Nepal, a loss that devastated him. Despite his grief, Hillary carried on his philanthropic work, supported by his son Peter, who would himself become an accomplished mountaineer. In later years, Hillary served as New Zealand's High Commissioner to India and Bangladesh, maintaining his lifelong connection to South Asia. Sir Edmund Hillary died on January 11, 2008 in Auckland. He was given a state funeral, a testament to the place he held in New Zealand's heart. He was not only a mountaineer but a national icon, a humanitarian, and a modest, deeply decent man who viewed his own fame with a characteristic lack of pretension. His legacy is vast. He opened the world's highest mountain to the possibility of ascent, but more importantly, he modelled what it meant to use that fame for others. His achievements remind us that exploration is not simply about reaching summits, but about forging connections, respecting other cultures, and giving back to the communities that make adventure possible. Sir Edmund Hillary's life stands as one of the 20th century's great stories of courage, humility, and service, a testament to human possibility at its highest and best. Well, that's all for tonight. If you're still awake, feel free to get comfortable and stay a little longer. The rain will now begin to fall softly for you. Just relax, breathe, and rest as long as you need.